After my husband's funeral, his lawyer said, he asked me to give you this USB drive in 6 months. Today, when I plugged it into the computer, there was one video. Darling, my death was not an accident. Our daughter. When he revealed what she had done. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think grief was the worst thing a person could survive. I was wrong. My name is Margaret Holloway, Maggie to everyone who loved me. For 41 years, I was Frank Holloway's wife. We raised our family in a cream-colored colonial house on Birchwood Lane in Dayton, Ohio, with a porch swing and a garden. Frank tended every Saturday morning in his old flannel shirt. We weren't wealthy people. We were comfortable. We had a savings account, a modest retirement fund, a paid-off house, and a life insurance policy Frank had kept faithfully since 1989. We had 2 children, our son Thomas, who lived in Portland with his family, and our daughter Diana. Diana. Even now, writing her name feels like pressing a bruise. Frank died on a Tuesday in March. The official report said cardiac arrest. He was 69, slightly overweight, with a history of elevated blood pressure. On paper, it looked like the kind of death no one questions. The paramedics were kind. The neighbors brought casseroles. Diana arrived within hours, red-eyed and composed in a way I couldn't quite read at the time. She handled the funeral home, the flowers, the reception. She was efficient, organized. I was too deep in shock to notice what I should have noticed. She never really cried. Thomas flew in from Portland. He held me while I wept. He stayed for 2 weeks. Diana stayed for 4 days and then returned to Columbus, where she lived with her husband, Cody, a broad-shouldered man with a salesman's smile and a habit of making everything about money, without ever quite saying so directly. The first strange moment came about 3 weeks after the funeral. I was going through Frank's desk, the old oak one he'd had since before we were married, looking for the password to his email account. I needed to cancel a magazine subscription. Instead of the password, I found a folded piece of paper tucked under the desk blotter. It was a handwritten note in Frank's careful block letters. If anything happens to me, talk to Garrett first. Don't sign anything. Garrett Simmons was Frank's attorney. They'd been friends since high school. I held that note for a long time. Frank had been a careful man, a methodical man. He didn't write notes like that out of anxiety. He wrote them because he meant them. I refolded it and put it in my cardigan pocket. And I didn't tell Diana. Looking back, I should have called Garrett immediately. Instead, I did what grieving women my age are trained to do. I made tea, I sat with the feeling, and I waited. Diana called twice that week. Both times she steered the conversation toward the house. Have you thought about downsizing, Mom? That place is a lot for one person. Then toward the finances. Did Dad leave instructions about the accounts? Cody knows a good financial advisor. I answered carefully, the way you answer when something itches at the back of your mind, but you can't yet name it. Then, 6 months to the day after Frank's funeral, Garrett Simmons called me. His voice was measured but warm. He said Frank had left something with him, an item, with instructions that it be given to me exactly 6 months after his death. Not before. He asked if I could come to his office. I drove to Garrett's office on a gray Thursday morning. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a USB drive, black, no label. Garrett told me Frank had brought it to him 8 months before he died. He said Frank had been concerned about some things at home, but hadn't elaborated. His instructions were precise. If he died of any cause within the following 2 years, Garrett was to give the drive to me, and only to me, 6 months after. I drove home with the drive in my coat pocket, my hands steadier than I expected. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Frank and I had eaten 30 years of dinners, opened my laptop, and plugged it in. There was one file, a video. Frank's face filled the screen, He was sitting in his car from the angle. I recognized the headrest. His voice was quiet and deliberate. "Maggie, if you're watching this, I'm gone, and I need you to know it wasn't an accident." He paused. He looked directly into the camera. "It's Diana." The kitchen was completely silent. Outside, a bird called once and stopped. I watched my husband's face on a screen, 6 months dead, and I listened to what our daughter had done. I watched the video 4 times before I could breathe normally. Frank had recorded it in his car, parked, I would later realize, in the lot behind the public library, 2 miles from our house. He'd chosen that location deliberately, somewhere Diana would never think to look for him, somewhere without the ambient sounds of home that might identify the setting. He had always been a careful man. Even in his fear, he was careful. In the video, he spoke for 11 minutes. His voice never cracked. He told me what he had discovered over the preceding year. Quietly, piece by piece, the way you find a leak in a ceiling by watching where the stain spreads. It had started with the life insurance policy. Frank had maintained a policy worth $340,000, with me listed as the sole beneficiary. 18 months before he died, he'd received a letter from the insurance company noting a beneficiary update request had been submitted. He hadn't submitted it. When he called the company, he was told the request had been made in writing, with what appeared to be his signature. He'd managed to block the change and restore my name. But he'd kept the letter. Then came the medication. Frank had high blood pressure. Managed for years with a low-dose prescription. His doctor was a mild-mannered man named Dr. Ellison, whom Frank had seen for a decade. At a routine visit, Dr. Ellison mentioned that Frank's dosage had been adjusted following a phone consultation. Frank had never requested an adjustment. Dr. Ellison's office, when pressed, had a record of a call, but couldn't locate who had made it. Frank didn't confront Diana. He was afraid of being wrong. He was afraid of what being right would mean, so instead, he began documenting. In the video, he told me where to find what he'd gathered, a small fireproof box on the top shelf of the garage, behind a row of old paint cans, locked with a combination, our wedding anniversary, backward. He ended with, "I love you, Maggie. I'm sorry I didn't protect you better. Don't let her have the house." The screen went dark. I sat at the kitchen table until the light changed. It was late afternoon when I finally stood, washed my face at the sink, and made a decision. I was 68 years old. I had spent most of my adult life making sure other people were comfortable. I was not going to spend whatever time I had left being afraid of my own daughter. But fear is not a switch you turn off. It lives in the body. My hands trembled as I poured a glass of water. My chest felt tight in a way that reminded me I was not young and not invincible. What if Diana found out I'd watched the video? What if Cody, who had a temper I'd always quietly noted, decided the easiest solution was to make me as convenient as Frank had been made? I sat with those fears. I let them be real, and then I began to think practically. The first thing I did was not go to the garage. I was too exposed. Diana had a key to my house. She'd had one for years for emergencies. I didn't know if she'd made copies. I didn't know if she watched the house. So I left the drive in the laptop, copied the file to a second drive I found in Frank's desk drawer, and hid one copy in a tin of buttons in my sewing basket, the other in my coat lining. Then I sat down with a legal pad and wrote out what I knew and what I needed. What I knew. Frank believed Diana had attempted to alter his life insurance beneficiary using a forged signature. He believed his medication had been tampered with. Someone had called his doctor's office and arranged an adjustment he hadn't requested. He had died of cardiac arrest at 69, which was medically plausible, but, in this light, raised questions. What I needed: the contents of the fireproof box, a conversation with Garrett Simmons, A real conversation, not a formal legal one yet. A doctor who could look at Frank's medical records, and a plan that didn't tip Diana off before I had something solid. I wrote it in columns. I had always been organized. 30 years as an elementary school librarian teaches you to think in systems. This was just a different kind of catalog. My plan had 4 steps. Step 1, retrieve the box alone without telling anyone. Step 2, review everything Frank had gathered, then speak to Garrett privately. Step 3, find out whether Frank's medical records showed anything unusual. Step 4, take whatever I had to someone with the authority to act on it. I didn't know yet whether that would be the police, a lawyer, or someone else. I didn't know if what Frank had gathered was enough. What I knew was this: I was his wife. I had 41 years of knowing how his mind worked. And if Frank Holloway, the most measured man I had ever met, had sat in a parking lot and recorded a video naming our daughter, he had reasons. Good ones. I went to the garage the following morning at 7 a.m. while the street was quiet. The box was exactly where he said it would be. Heavy, gray, fireproof. I turned the combination lock. 1183, our anniversary backward. It opened with a soft click. Inside were documents, letters, a small notebook in Frank's handwriting, a printed copy of the insurance beneficiary request, with what was indeed his signature, or something that looked very much like it. My hands steadied. This was real. I spent 2 days reading everything in that box before I called Garrett. Frank's notebook was the most difficult thing. It was a small, brown-covered composition book, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore, and he had used it the way a detective uses a case file. Dates, names, observations written in his compact handwriting. He'd begun keeping it 14 months before he died. The entries started with the insurance letter, then came the medication. Then a third thread I hadn't anticipated: money. Frank had discovered, through a routine review of his own accounts, that someone had accessed his online banking using a device he didn't recognize. The access had occurred 4 times over 6 months, always in the evening, always from the same unidentified device. Nothing had been transferred, but the access was real. He'd contacted the bank and changed his password. He'd noted in the book, Diana's birthday, the original password, changed. She had known his password. She had used it to look at his accounts, to see, Frank suspected, exactly what was there. And the life insurance policy beneficiary was listed in those accounts as a linked document. The picture assembled itself with ugly clarity. The third day, I drove to Garrett's office without calling ahead. His receptionist, a young woman named Beth who had known Frank, looked at me with something careful in her eyes when I walked in. Garrett came out himself within 5 minutes. We sat in his private office, the door closed. I placed Frank's notebook on the desk between us. Garrett read in silence for 15 minutes. Then he looked up at me over his reading glasses. "Maggie," he said quietly, "how long have you had this?" I told him about the box. I told him about the video. I told him everything Frank had told me in that measured, careful voice of his from beyond a car headrest. Garrett listened without interrupting. When I finished, the office was very still. He told me 2 things. First, what Frank had documented, the insurance forgery attempt, the unauthorized bank access, the medical records issue, was potentially actionable. The forged signature alone could constitute fraud. If Frank's death were found to have been hastened by medication tampering, it could be far worse. Second, we needed to move carefully because nothing was yet proven, and a premature accusation against Diana, my own daughter, Frank's daughter, would, if it failed, leave me exposed legally, financially, and personally. He recommended I not speak to Diana about any of this. He recommended I authorize him to request Frank's medical records through official channels, and he recommended I contact a detective, not the local police, not yet, but a licensed private investigator who specialized in financial fraud and could help establish the chain of evidence. I agreed to all of it. I signed 2 authorizations before I left. On the drive home, my phone rang. "Diana," I answered. My voice was steady. "Hi, sweetheart." She asked how I was doing. She asked with a lightness that wasn't quite light whether I'd heard anything from Garrett recently. She knew about the 6-month provision. Frank's will had included a brief mention of documents with Garrett, though not their nature. She'd always been efficient at reading paperwork. "He just checked in," I said. "Standard estate stuff, nothing new." There was the smallest pause. "Good," she said. "Well, let me know if you need anything, Mom." After I hung up, I sat in the driveway for a moment. She was watching. She didn't know what I knew, but she knew the timeline had passed, and she was paying attention. 3 weeks later, Garrett called me to his office again. He had the medical records. He had also, through a contact he trusted, engaged a private investigator named Lena Park, mid-50s, former insurance fraud examiner, precise and unsentimental. Lena had, in those 3 weeks, traced the device used to access Frank's bank account. It was registered to a cellular plan under the name Cody Marsh. Cody, Diana's husband. Lena had also obtained, through the insurance company's fraud division, which Garrett had quietly alerted, a handwriting analysis of the beneficiary change request. The preliminary finding: the signature was inconsistent with Frank's known samples. It was a close forgery, but a forgery. I sat in Garrett's office and looked at those 2 documents. The room felt very far away and very close at once. "Is this enough?" I asked Garrett. He took off his glasses and looked at me directly. "Not yet," he said. "But it's a beginning, and Maggie, it's a real one." I drove home through a gray Ohio afternoon, and I thought about my daughter. I thought about the little girl who used to fall asleep in Frank's lap during the evening news. I thought about the woman who had stood at her father's grave in a black coat, dry-eyed and efficient. I thought about the 11 minutes of Frank's voice in a parking lot, choosing his words with the care of a man who knew he might not have many left. And I thought, how long had she been planning this? How long had she sat across from us at Sunday dinners, watching the clock? The answer, I suspected, had been sitting in that brown notebook all along. The plan, as Garrett and Lena and I had built it, had a simple architecture. Lena would complete her financial investigation and document the bank access formally. Garrett would work with the insurance company's fraud division to pursue the forgery through civil channels, which would generate an official record without requiring an immediate criminal filing. And I would, in the meantime, do the thing that required the most discipline: act as though nothing had changed. I called Diana twice a week. I asked about Cody. I mentioned the garden. I told her I was sleeping better. Each call was a small performance, and I was better at it than I expected. Perhaps because I had spent many years being the steady one, the calm one, the woman who managed difficult things without showing the seams. The breaking point came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. Cody called me on a Saturday morning using Diana's phone, which was unusual. He was warm. He was chattier than normal. He asked about my finances in the way people do when they're pretending to ask about something else. "Have you thought about what you're going to do with the house long term? With everything going up, it might be smart to lock in some value now." He mentioned twice a financial planning service a friend of his ran. I said I'd think about it. The following Tuesday, Lena called. She had found something new: a second insurance policy. Not Frank's. Mine. A term life policy that had been opened in my name 18 months earlier, with Cody listed as co-applicant and Diana as beneficiary. I had not opened this policy. I had not signed anything related to it. When I heard that, the fear I'd been managing carefully flared into something hotter. This was not just about Frank. This had been about both of us. I called Garrett immediately. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Maggie, I think it's time to go to the police." We went together, Garrett and I, along with Lena and her documentation file, to the Dayton Police Department on a Wednesday morning. We met with a detective named Brian Schofield, a compact man in his 50s with an attentive way of listening. We laid out everything: the video, the notebook, the forged signature, the bank device traced to Cody, the fraudulent insurance policy in my name. Detective Schofield was careful. He said the forgery and fraudulent insurance filing were clearly prosecutable. The question of Frank's death, whether the medication alteration had contributed to his cardiac arrest, would require a forensic review. He took everything we brought and opened a formal investigation. That evening, Diana called. Her voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but underneath it, something harder. "Mom, someone from the insurance company called Cody today about some kind of review of Dad's policy." "I don't know anything about that," I said. "Are you sure you haven't talked to anyone? An attorney, maybe?" "Diana, your father just died. I've been talking to Garrett about the estate." The pause was longer this time. "Okay," she said. "I just don't want you getting confused by people who might be trying to take advantage of you. You've been through a lot." That last sentence, the careful implication that I was fragile, confused, susceptible, told me exactly what she was preparing. If she couldn't control the situation, she would contest my competence. 2 days later, Cody appeared at my door. He wasn't threatening, not overtly. He came with coffee from the place I liked, and he sat at my kitchen table and he talked for an hour. About how Diana worried about me, about how grief did strange things to people, about how sometimes, in the fog of loss, people made accusations. Not intentionally, of course, that could damage families beyond repair. He mentioned, gently, that if any misunderstandings had made their way to official ears, there was still time to walk things back before anyone got hurt. "No one wants to see this family torn apart, Maggie," he said. I looked at him across Frank's kitchen table, Frank's coffee maker behind him, Frank's calendar still on the wall, and I thought about a forged signature and a fake insurance policy in my name. "Thank you for the coffee, Cody," I said. He left, and when he did, I locked the door, changed the code on the door lock, called a locksmith to rekey the house, and called Garrett to tell him about the visit. Garrett documented it as attempted intimidation. After that, I allowed myself 3 quiet days. I drove to see my friend Carol in Cincinnati. We sat on her sun porch and drank iced tea, and I didn't tell her everything, not yet. But I let myself be an old woman who missed her husband, and that was enough. I needed my hands to stop shaking. I needed to sleep in a house where no one had the key. By the 3rd morning, I was ready again. Diana tried a softer approach. It was a Thursday evening, about 2 weeks after Cody's visit, when she called and asked if she could come see me. Just the 2 of us, no Cody. She wanted to reconnect. She was worried about me being isolated. She mentioned, almost incidentally, that she'd heard I'd had the locks changed. "The old locks were worn," I said. "The locksmith recommended it." A pause. "Of course," she said. She arrived on Saturday with a bouquet of yellow tulips, Frank's favorites. I noticed that. She had chosen them deliberately. She sat in my living room, in Frank's armchair, with a careful softness in her face that I recognized now for what it was: management. She talked about the past, childhood memories, the beach trip to the Outer Banks, the summer Thomas broke his arm, the year Frank lost his job and we all pulled together. She cried, lightly, at the right moments. She said she was afraid of losing what remained of the family. She said, "Dad would have wanted us to take care of each other." I listened to all of it. I kept my hands in my lap. I did not let my face change. Then she said, quietly, "Mom, I think someone may have given you information about me and Cody that isn't accurate. And I'm worried you might be moving forward with something that could hurt a lot of people, including yourself, based on a misunderstanding." She reached into her bag and produced a document. A letter from a therapist, she said, who specialized in complicated grief. She suggested gently that I might benefit from speaking with someone, that it wasn't uncommon for people who had suffered sudden loss to develop distorted perceptions. So there it was. I looked at the letter. I looked at my daughter. I thought of Frank's voice. 11 minutes. A parking lot. "Thank you, Diana," I said. "I'll think about it." She left the tulips. I put them in a vase and looked at them for a long time after she drove away. Yellow tulips had been Frank's Saturday tradition. He'd bought them every week from the farmer's market. The fact that she knew that and had used it told me everything about how much attention she'd always paid and how little she'd ever loved him, or me. Detective Schofield called the following week. The investigation was progressing. The forensic review of Frank's medical records had found something. His blood pressure medication had, in the final months of his life, been filled at a pharmacy he didn't normally use, a pharmacy 20 minutes from Diana and Cody's house in Columbus. The prescription had been altered. A higher dose than Dr. Ellison had prescribed. Not enough to be immediately obvious. Enough, over time, to destabilize a cardiovascular system that was already under stress. I sat with the phone in my hand after that call and didn't speak for a long time. The social support I needed came, quietly, from two directions. First, Carol, my Cincinnati friend, had by now guessed enough from my manner that she'd asked me directly if I was in trouble. I told her a measured version of the truth. She listened, and then she said something I've thought about since. "Maggie, the fact that you're calm right now is the most useful thing you have. Don't lose it." The second direction surprised me. Thomas, my son in Portland, had been kept mostly in the dark. I hadn't wanted to frighten him before I had something solid. But I called him that weekend. I told him everything. There was a long silence on the line. Then Thomas said, "Tell me what you need," I told him. He booked a flight for the following Friday. He brought his wife. He said nothing dramatic and asked no unnecessary questions and simply sat in my kitchen and helped me think through logistics. What documents needed to be copied and stored off-site, what the timeline might look like, how to protect the house financially in the interim. He also told me something I hadn't known, that Diana had called him twice in the weeks after the locks were changed, asking if he thought I seemed okay, mentioning that she was worried about Mom making decisions under stress. She had been trying to build a consensus, an advance narrative. Thomas had told her I seemed fine. He hadn't mentioned my calls to him. He was, I realized, his father's son. Careful when it mattered. Diana and Cody were watching. I could feel it. But watching was all they were doing now. The documents were already with the police. The investigation was already running. The only thing left was time. I kept the yellow tulips on the table until they dropped their petals. Then I threw them away. They came together the third time. It was a Sunday morning in May, unannounced. I heard the car in the driveway and recognized it from the window. Diana's silver Lexus. I took a breath, smoothed my sweater, and opened the door before they could knock. Cody was carrying a grocery bag. Diana had a container of something baked. They looked like a reconciliation visit. They had clearly planned this. I let them in. We sat in the living room. Diana poured coffee. She'd brought it in a thermos from my preferred place. And they settled in with the ease of people who intended to stay a while. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation was easy. Family small talk. Thomas's kids, the garden. Diana admired the tulip vase, still on the table with its last dry stems. She asked if I'd been sleeping. She asked if I'd been eating properly. Each question was warm on the surface and diagnostic underneath. She was taking inventory, gauging how I was holding up, looking for cracks. I answered pleasantly and gave her nothing. Then Cody set down his cup and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and the salesman's warmth clicked off like a light. "Maggie," he said, "we need to talk about what you've been doing." He told me, without naming his sources, that he was aware I had spoken to the police, that I had apparently given them certain materials about the family, that this was a painful and destructive thing to do, and that if I continued, I would be making an enemy of the people who were trying to help me. Diana said, softer. "Mom, Dad left you some papers and you've clearly been frightened by them. We understand that. But you need to think about what an investigation does to a family, to Thomas's family, to the grandchildren, to everything Dad worked for." She paused. "We're willing to make sure you're taken care of. The house, your expenses. We can work all of that out privately, without courts, without lawyers. You just need to stop." There it was, the transaction. I looked at my daughter. I thought about yellow tulips as instruments of manipulation. I thought about a man alone in a car, recording 11 careful minutes because he was afraid to die in his own house. I thought about a fake insurance policy in my name. "I appreciate you coming," I said. Cody's jaw tightened. "Maggie, I'm serious. This doesn't end well for you if you push it." "Is that a threat, Cody?" "It's a reality," he said. "We have resources. We have our own lawyers. If you take this to court and it falls apart, and it can be made to fall apart, you end up alone, you end up discredited, and you end up with nothing." He leaned back, and something else crossed his face. Something almost contemptuous, as though he had decided the pleasantries were no longer worth the effort. He talked about legal costs. He talked about how long investigations dragged on. He talked about the emotional toll on a woman my age of pursuing something so adversarial. Every sentence was calibrated. Every pause was placed deliberately. He had done this before. Not necessarily this conversation, but this mode of pressure. He was a man who had spent his career turning leverage into outcomes. Diana placed her hand on my arm. "We don't want that. We want to take care of you." I looked at her hand on my arm. I thought of how she had placed flowers on Frank's grave with the same hand, how she had signed his name on an insurance document with the same hand, or directed someone to. "You should go," I said. For a moment, Cody didn't move. Then he stood slowly, and the pleasantness was entirely gone from his face. Diana gathered her thermos and her baking container with quick, tight movements. At the door, she turned back. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Maybe," I said, "but it's mine to make." I closed the door. I heard the Lexus back out of the driveway. Then I stood in the entryway, my heart going hard and fast, and I let myself be afraid for exactly 3 minutes. I timed it. The fear was real. Cody's point wasn't wrong. They could make things difficult. They had money. They had lawyers. An investigation could stall. Forensic evidence could be challenged. I was 68, a widow, and without Frank's steadiness beside me, I was, in some ways, genuinely alone. But the fear sharpened something. I had been working for months with my head. Documents, procedures, phone calls, patience. Now my gut caught up. These were not people who had been careless or cornered into something. They had planned this. They had planned the insurance, the medication, the forged signature, the false policy in my name. They had planned me, how I would grieve, how I would soften, what I would accept. And Cody's speech just now, that smooth, escalating machinery of it, that hadn't been improvised. He had rehearsed it. Maybe more than once. That realization settled something in me permanently. I stopped wondering whether I was doing the right thing. I stopped second-guessing the toll. When someone rehearses a speech designed to make you abandon your dead husband's last request, You are no longer in the territory of family disagreements. You are somewhere else entirely, and you had better know it. I picked up my phone and called Garrett. They made an offer, I said. And Cody made a threat. I need you to document both. And I want to know when Detective Schofield moves forward. Garrett's voice was steady. I'll call him today. The investigation was about to become something more. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in late June. It was not a criminal trial. Not yet. It was a civil fraud proceeding initiated by the insurance company, which had, after completing its own investigation in parallel with Detective Schofield's, formally alleged that Diana Marsh, née Holloway, and her husband Cody Marsh had submitted a fraudulent beneficiary change request on a policy belonging to Frank Holloway. That proceeding had been joined by the state attorney's office, which had opened a parallel criminal investigation. A separate civil complaint regarding the fraudulent policy in my name had also been filed. I dressed carefully that morning. The navy blazer I'd bought for Frank's retirement dinner, low heels, the small pearl earrings Frank had given me on our 30th anniversary. I stood at the mirror before I left and looked at myself for a long moment. I had lost weight in the past year. There were shadows under my eyes that hadn't been there before, but my expression, I noticed this was something like quiet surprise, was steady. Not hard. Steady. I thought of what Carol had said. The fact that you're calm right now is the most useful thing you have. I had tried to keep it. Garrett sat beside me in the hearing room. Thomas sat behind me with his wife, Claire. Lena Park was in the row behind them. Detective Schofield was present as a consulting officer. Diana and Cody sat across the room with their attorney, a sharp-looking man I didn't know. Diana was dressed carefully in a charcoal blazer, her hair pinned back. She looked composed and professional, like a woman attending a business meeting she expected to run efficiently. Cody wore a dark suit and held a legal pad he didn't write on. He turned the pen over and over in his hand, the only visible sign of anything other than patience. They had prepared for this. Of course they had. Diana didn't look at me when I came in. I found my seat and arranged my folder of documents on the table and did not look for her reaction. The hearing was methodical and largely procedural for the first hour. Then Diana's attorney did something that surprised everyone in the room. He requested the floor and announced that his clients had new information to present that contradicted the fraud findings. He produced an affidavit. It claimed that Frank had, in a conversation with Diana approximately 2 years before his death, expressed his intention to update his estate planning to include her more substantially. The affidavit asserted that Diana had understood this as authorization to begin preliminary paperwork. The room was quiet. The implication was clear, that the forged signature wasn't fraud, but an administrative error made in good faith based on a verbal understanding. It was a plausible enough construction, the kind that might create reasonable doubt if the documentation on our side were thinner. I watched Diana as her attorney spoke. She was listening with a practiced attentiveness, nodding once or twice at key phrases. It was, I realized, a rehearsed performance, not of innocence, of credibility. There is a difference, and she had learned it somewhere. Cody's expression was a degree too flat, the face of someone concentrating very hard on appearing neutral. And then Garrett rose. He had anticipated this, because Frank, meticulous Frank, had anticipated it too. In the fireproof box, among the other documents, there had been one more item I hadn't fully understood until Garrett explained it to me weeks earlier. A sworn, notarized statement, signed by Frank Holloway 14 months before his death, explicitly confirming that he had not authorized any changes to his insurance beneficiaries or estate documents, had not communicated any such intention to his children, and was recording this statement out of concern that such claims might be made in the future. Garrett placed the document on the table. The notarization was dated, witnessed and clear. I watched Diana's attorney read it. He read it twice. He set it down and turned to his clients. And in that moment, in the 2 seconds of his turned back, Diana's face showed me something I had never seen on it before. Not anger, not calculation. Something younger and more unguarded than either. Something that looked almost like the moment before a person begins to understand that the ground has shifted and will not shift back. Her attorney asked for a recess. He spoke quietly with his clients. I watched Diana lean in toward Cody, and I watched something shift in her face. The first genuine crack in the composure she had maintained since March of last year. Her voice rose slightly, just slightly, in a way I could hear across the room without making out the words. Cody said something back, sharp and low. Diana shook her head. He said it again, and she turned away from him with a small, controlled motion. The motion of a woman who has just heard something she didn't want confirmed. Whatever their plan had been, whatever contingency they had prepared, it had not accounted for Frank's notarized statement. He had written it 14 months before his death. He had known exactly what defense they might attempt, and he had sealed the door against it before they could reach for the handle. That was Frank, still careful, still 3 steps ahead. Detective Schofield, during the recess, received a message on his phone. He read it twice, stood, and spoke briefly with Garrett. Garrett came back to me with steady eyes. The pharmacy records came through, he said quietly. Full chain of documentation. The prescription for Frank's medication, the altered one, was called in from a phone registered to Cody Marsh. I placed my hands flat on the table. When the hearing reconvened, Diana's attorney requested additional time to review new materials. The judge denied the request. The insurance fraud finding was confirmed. The forged signature was formally entered into the record. The fraudulent policy in my name was documented, and Detective Schofield submitted a formal statement to the court that a criminal investigation had found evidence sufficient to recommend charges in connection with pharmaceutical fraud and potential contribution to the death of Frank Holloway. Cody's composure broke before Diana's did. He said, audibly, something sharp and ugly to his attorney. The judge looked at him. His attorney put a hand on his arm. Diana looked at me for the first time since the hearing began. I looked back at her. I didn't feel the things I had expected to feel. Not triumph, not grief, not the hot flash of anger I'd managed for months. I felt something quieter than all of those. Something that felt strangely like the end of a very long wait. Like setting down something heavy that you have carried so long you forgot it had weight. She looked away first. The criminal charges came down 6 weeks after the hearing. Diana and Cody were charged jointly. Insurance fraud, forgery of financial documents, and pharmaceutical fraud. The charge of criminally negligent homicide in connection with Frank's death was added following a formal forensic review, which concluded that the sustained over-medication of Frank's blood pressure prescription had materially contributed to the cardiac event that killed him. It was not the clean, dramatic murder of crime novels. It was slower and uglier, a prolonged chemical erosion of a man who had trusted his pharmacist and his doctor, engineered by people who understood enough about medicine to know that patience was more reliable than violence. The forensic report described the mechanism in language I read 3 times before I let myself put it down. The altered dosage had been within a range that could plausibly be explained as a prescribing adjustment. Nothing immediately fatal. Nothing that would raise flags on its own. Sustained over months, in a man with Frank's cardiovascular profile, it created conditions that dramatically elevated his risk. The review concluded that without the altered prescription, Frank Holloway's cardiac event, while not impossible, was significantly less likely to have occurred when it did. That was the sentence I kept returning to. Significantly less likely. In the language of forensic medicine, That was as close to certainty as they would put in writing. The fraudulent life insurance policy in my name, the one with Cody as co-applicant and Diana as beneficiary, constituted a separate charge of attempted financial fraud. Their attorney negotiated through the summer. He was good at his job. But the evidence was what it was. Frank's notarized statement, the pharmacy records, the device trace on the bank access, the handwriting analysis, the insurance fraud division's findings. Each piece was a separate document, created at a separate time by separate institutions. There was no single document that could be challenged and dismissed. There was a chain, and chains are harder to break than individual links. Their attorney knew it. They knew it. The negotiations were, in many ways, a formality. The movement of people who had understood privately what the public proceedings would confirm. In October, 7 months after I had first walked into Garrett's office with a USB drive in my coat pocket, Diana and Cody accepted a plea agreement. Cody pled guilty to pharmaceutical fraud and insurance forgery. He received 4 years in a federal correctional facility and 5 years probation. Diana pled guilty to insurance fraud and complicity in the pharmaceutical matter. She received 3 years, with 18 months served, and the remainder as supervised release with mandatory conditions. Their assets were subject to civil forfeiture proceedings to cover restitution, to me and to Frank's estate. I was present for the plea hearing. I was not required to be. Garrett had told me I could stay home if I preferred, that my presence wasn't legally necessary. I went anyway. Not out of anger. I had made peace, or something close to it, with the anger months earlier. I went because Frank had not been able to be present for his own vindication, and someone who had loved him should be. Diana entered her plea quietly. She did not look at me. Her voice was steady and entirely emptied of effect, the voice of someone who has made a calculation and is executing it without sentiment. I recognized that quality in her. I had been watching her manage herself for 40 years and hadn't known what I was watching. She said, "Guilty," and sat back down, and her attorney made a brief statement about cooperation and remorse, and the judge acknowledged it and moved on. Cody entered his plea with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the middle distance. He did not appear remorseful. He appeared like a man who was angry about the outcome of a bet he'd believed was safe. The judge noted the terms. It was done. The house on Birchwood Lane remained mine. The life insurance policy, Frank's $340,000, which had never been successfully altered, was paid to me as originally specified. Garrett helped me structure a trust that protected both principal assets. Lena Park shook my hand on the courthouse steps and said simply, "He was right to trust you." Thomas and Claire were with me that day. Thomas didn't say much. He put his arm around my shoulders on the courthouse steps, and we stood there in the October air. And I thought about the 41 years Frank and I had built, and the ways they had tried to dismantle it, and the way it had held. It held because Frank had been careful. It held because he had trusted me to handle it. It held because I had been, despite my fear and my grief and my 68 years, the kind of woman who keeps records and doesn't sign things she doesn't understand and knows the difference between someone asking, "How are you?" and someone mapping your vulnerabilities. Diana didn't look at me on the courthouse steps. She walked to a waiting car with her attorney and was gone. I thought of the little girl with the gap-toothed smile in the school photos on Frank's desk. I let myself grieve that person, the one that had existed, or that I had believed existed. And then I put her away. There was one more thing. Detective Schofield, in the weeks following the plea, told me that the investigation had revealed something about the timeline that made the whole structure visible at once. Diana and Cody had begun their planning not after Frank's health declined, but 3 years before his death, after he had, entirely unaware, mentioned at a holiday dinner that his retirement accounts had grown significantly. They had sat across from us at Christmas dinner with the knowledge of what they intended. They had smiled. They had passed the potatoes. They had watched us with the patient attention of people who had decided the outcome and were simply waiting for the timing to align. I thought about that for a long time, and then I stopped thinking about it because there was nothing useful in it anymore. The garden needed attention. Frank's flannel shirt was still on the hook by the garage door, and one Saturday morning in late October, I took it down, held it for a moment, and then folded it carefully and set it aside. I put on my own jacket and went out to the garden, and I worked until the light changed, and the soil was dark and turned and ready for spring. The first full year after the plea was, in many ways, the hardest. And also, slowly and unexpectedly, the most alive I had felt in a long time. Grief doesn't follow resolutions. Frank was still gone. The house was still quiet on Saturday mornings. The farmer's market still sold yellow tulips, and for a long time I walked past that stall without stopping. But there is a difference between grief without clarity and grief with it. I knew now the full shape of what I had lost and what I had preserved, and the knowledge, though it brought no comfort in the simple sense, gave me a kind of ground to stand on. I returned to volunteering at the Dayton Public Library, where I had worked for so many years. The work was familiar. It organized my days. The librarians were glad to have me, and the regulars, the children, the older patrons, the teenagers who didn't know they were becoming readers yet, were a kind of company I had not realized how much I needed. Thomas and Claire visited 4 times that year. They brought the grandchildren, Emma and Noah, 7 and 9, who had always been a little formal around me in the way of children who sensed adult tension. That year, without the tension, they relaxed. Emma decided she wanted to read every book Frank had left on the shelves. Noah planted tomatoes in the garden with me and took personal offense when the rabbits got to them. I found myself laughing in the way I hadn't laughed in years. The involuntary kind. The kind that catches you off guard. Carol from Cincinnati drove up most months. We established a standing Thursday morning call. She had been, I realized, one of the few people who had held me at steady during the worst of it, without needing to be told how serious it was. Lena Park and I had coffee twice. She was a composed, unsentimental woman, but she told me once, over a cup of black coffee in a diner downtown, that my case had been one of the cleaner ones, meaning that the documentation was unusually thorough. She attributed that to Frank. I thought she was right. Garrett Simmons retired the following spring, and at his retirement party, I stood up without being asked and told the room briefly what he had done. He looked at his shoes the entire time. I told the room anyway. As for Diana and Cody, Cody served his sentence at a minimum security federal facility in southern Ohio. He was a difficult prisoner by all accounts. Complaints from staff, a disciplinary incident in the 2nd year. He was denied early release consideration. Diana, in her supervised release, was required to meet conditions that included regular check-ins, restricted financial activity, and no contact with me. She complied, as far as I knew, because she had to. Their house in Columbus had been heavily mortgaged, and the legal costs, between the criminal defense and the civil forfeiture, had consumed most of their savings. The house went into foreclosure in the winter following sentencing. Diana moved to an apartment in a suburb I didn't know. I heard, through Thomas, that she had taken a job at a retail store. I did not hear this with satisfaction. I heard it the way you receive any news about a stranger you once knew well. A moment of recognition, and then the quiet return of your own life. Thomas told me once that Diana had asked if she could write to me. He told her he would pass it along. He told me. I thought about it for some time. I decided not to respond. Not from cruelty. I believed, perhaps naively, that she carried her own weight of things. But I also believed that forgiveness, if it was ever to happen, would happen in its own time and on its own terms, and not because someone required it of me. I had spent enough of my life managing other people's comfort. What I did instead, in that second year, was begin to write. Not a memoir, nothing so formal. Just the account you are reading. A record. The way Frank kept records, the way librarians keep records. Because what happens should be remembered accurately, and because other people might need to know that a 68-year-old woman in a navy blazer with a USB drive and a locked gray box and a good attorney can walk into a courtroom and tell the truth and have it matter. I planted Frank's garden that spring. I bought yellow tulips from the farmer's market and put them in the blue vase on the kitchen table. And I sat with my morning coffee and looked at them, and I thought. He loved those, and I let myself love them too. I've thought a lot about what Frank's story teaches, and what mine does. He taught me that a careful person leaves a trail, that love, practical and unglamorous, looks like a locked gray box and 11 minutes in a parking lot. I learned that grief can be used against you, that silence can be a strategy, and that the most important question isn't what would I do? It's what am I willing to do when it costs something? What would you have done? If you had found that drive, would you have watched it? Would you have acted? Would you have had the patience to wait, to document, to refuse the easier road? I don't ask to judge the answer. I ask because these stories, the real ones, the quiet ones, deserve to be heard. If this reached you, I hope it stays with you. And I hope if you ever need it, you remember. The truth, documented and patient, is harder to destroy than anything they can bring against it. Thank you for listening to Frank's story. And mine.